Hello, I'm working on the Florence dress by Merchant and Mills, and I've worked on this dress with a couple of students before, and every time we get to step number 6 it kind of confuses people. So I just wanted to make a really quick video just to explain a couple of steps about how to apply the neck binding and to finish off the back opening. I've done step 4 and I've pressed down 1 centimetre on the unnotched side of the neck binding. I've turned under the seam allowance on the back edge there, and then I'm going to bring that right side together. So I'm folding where the notch is here, marking the fold line, and bringing the fabric right sides together so that the folded edge of the seam allowance matches the other notch a bit further along. Then I can just pin that in place here to hold it, and then repeat that on the other side. So the seam allowance has been pressed under, and then fold that right side together, folding where the notch is just there, bringing this folded edge to meet the other notch. This isn't the notch for the centre back, these are the notches for the fold line and where the edge of the button stand should meet. The next thing to do is to apply the binding. The binding is applied to the right side, so I'm applying the right side of the binding to the right side of the fabric. And this notch here matches this notch here, so that the edge of the binding covers the turned under part of the seam allowance on the back edge. And then as I pin round, I've got more notches on here, so I have another notch that matches where the shoulder seam is, so I can pin here. I like to put in 2 pins at the shoulder seam to keep the seam allowances open. And then as I work my way round, this notch here will match the centre front. This notch here is going to match this shoulder seam, and then the final notch, again this notch close to the end will match with this notch here, and the end of the bias tape will cover the seam allowance that I've turned under on the back neck edge. Just going to find the centre front by folding in half, matching the shoulder seams, folding the front in half, and then I can just mark with a pin, or you could just make a little snip where the centre of the front is, and then you can match your notch there where you've marked, and then just carry on matching the binding all the way around the neck edge. And the next thing is to sew with a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around from the back edge to the other back edge. Next, I'm going to trim the seam allowance and clip the curves. Just have a quick check to make sure I'm happy with the stitching before I trim and clip anything. What will happen is this back edge will be turned out. You get a nice corner here, and this binding is going to be folded right to the inside, and the raw edges here will be covered over, and then this will sit flat. So the binding will sit to the inside of the neckline all the way round. So before it's turned through, I'm going to trim off some of the seam allowance just clip around the curve so it sits in a curve much better once it's to the inside. And then I'm also going to understitch, which they don't ask you to do in the instructions, but I prefer to understitch by binding, so I'll show you that step in just a second. So to begin with, I will be trimming. I'm going to just cut across the corner at the back, not right up to the stitching but pretty close, and then where I've got curves around my seams, particularly around the back here, I'm just going to put a few clips into the seam allowance, just because that's going to allow that to sit a bit flatter, and then also around the front. The next step is to understitch, and I'm going to do that just round the binding section and not across where the back will turn through. So I'm going to start just from where the binding is here and then just understitch from here. So the understitching will go through the binding. It's going to sit a couple of millimeters, 1/8 of an inch from where the seam line is here, so about here, and it will be done all the way round, and it's going to catch that seam allowance on the underside. So if I pin a bit more, you can see that's where the stitch line's going on the right side, and then underneath it's catching the seam allowance here. And once the binding's turned to the inside, you won't see this line of stitching, so it's not top stitching. The top stitching will be done afterwards, but the understitching will just help that edge to sit to the inside. I'm using a blind hemming foot because I can adjust it so that this white marker sits along the ditch of the seam, and then I can make sure that the needle's going to go in an even distance away from the seam all the way round. You can see there how close the understitching is to the seam, but when you turn it, it just means that binding's going to sit to the inside much better and much more neatly. The next thing is to turn back the button stand and the neck binding to the wrong side. So I'm just going to fold the corner over there, and with it held folded, then I just put my thumb through there. If you've got a point turner, something like this, it's quite useful to then just push that corner out a bit more so that you've got a sharper, better corner point. I'm going to repeat that on this end, and I'll just cut the threads there, and then again just fold that edge under, then turn that through, and then just use my point turner just to get that point right out there. And now I'm going to turn under the edge of the binding along the fold that I pressed earlier, and then turn that to the inside, and then I shall just pin that in position ready for my top stitching. Now that I've turned and pinned the bias binding in place, I'm also going to turn back the button stand and pin that into position along the back edge. You want to make sure that this is an even depth all the way along. So if you just measure at the top, and then you can make sure that that's the same measurement then at the bottom, then I'll just pin along this edge And then when I do my top stitching, I'm going to top stitch along here and then round the bias binding around the neckline. You'll see on the back here that I actually applied more interfacing than the pattern suggested, and I took my interfacing all the way to the edge of the button stand because this is quite a thin double gauze, so I wanted to make sure that it had enough structure there to hold the buttons and the buttonholes. You can see on the bottom here also that I've applied some strips of interfacing and I've stitched through them to stabilise this lower edge. And now I'll do my top stitching. I'm going to use the blind hemming foot again with this guide to keep my top stitching an even distance from the folded edge of the fabric. Now the top stitching is complete, I can give this a really good press and then carry on with the construction and making the buttonholes on this back opening. I've actually gone ahead and put in the sleeves because I wanted to do a fitting before I went on to the next stage and made the buttonholes. But on the instructions, the buttonholes are made horizontally and you should line up the notch here at the bottom, which marks the centre back, with this notch on the other side, and when it's aligned it will sit like this so that you see this top stitching coming around the back here and the other top stitching coming around here. But I would much prefer it to overlap the button stand here on both sides, so that this edge here is going to come over and just cover where I've top stitched the button stand in place underneath. So I'm going to make mine cover it fully, and I've just tried this on and done a fitting, so I know it's going to work. And plus I've got some quite large buttons that I want to put on the back, and so I'm going to actually put my buttonholes going vertically and then put these buttons on. I've taken out the tailor's tacks that marked the original buttonholes, and I'm just going to remark those to better suit my vertical placement. The buttonholes are made and I've cut those open, and I think this is going to work much better than the horizontal ones shown on the pattern. So I'll be able to just position my button in the middle of the button stand underneath to get that to line up. Make sure when you sew your buttons on, you position them about 3mm from the top of the buttonhole, and that will mean that the buttonhole doesn't slide down to hit the top of the button and misalign the back opening. I didn't film the next part of the construction, which just involves gathering the skirt, attaching the skirt and then hemming. So here's a fast forward to the finished item.